Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Scrum Down NBC Sports Rugby podcast. I am your host with the most, Alex Corbs, and it is great to be back, everyone. For those watching, you can see I'm back in my usual home studio and lots to talk about on this week's show. Before we get to Ross Young reflecting on last week's episode, looking ahead to what we have to talk about today, we have to talk about the big news of England, losing to South Africa on the weekend. Their last performance in the autumn internationals, only coming away with one win this autumn, and that has led to Eddie Jones and the England team being under a lot of pressure. The RFU have announced there'll be a formal review. I think Eddie Jones had a few of these along the way. There's no sort of confirmation of who will be on that panel at the moment. That's been kept sort of anonymous at the moment. Some people calling for transparency. And I think, it hits some of the touch points similar to what we're talking about with USA Rugby of a high performance review. Who is going to do that review? Who is qualified? Is it the people that already hired, the people in place that have a vested interest in decisions, maybe not reflecting poorly on them if there's things that would seem to be wrong or change needed? Or is it going to be, for the best, for the union, the transparency? All of that things I think is a big discussion point. If you talk about the game itself, England were well beaten by South Africa. I was there live. It was a tough one to watch. I think they fell right into South Africa's traps. They didn't really fire any shots in attack, which is what I think got people the most frustrated. But I think really the big issue that Eddie's sort of, opened up is the scrum. There was areas around the breakdown which didn't help them, but pretty much domination at the scrum. I think there was a couple penalties maybe that could have gone the other way if seen a little bit differently, but on a whole, they were never in a position to go forward against the Springboks, and that's really been a theme through this autumn. I think England have a very good pack of forwards, amazing props in either Mako or Genge, Sinclair, Will Stewart. We hope Will Stewart's injury isn't too bad. He came off, looked like a bad elbow injury. Poor guy getting no luck with injury, but really, for me, the issues are more around crouch, bind, set. And I don't want to get into it and bore all the scrum sort of people who are turned off by the scrum. But really, for me, England have to update their technique and get to a position where they're winning more engages instead of just hoping for 50-50 outcomes. And that's when they hold teams. Until they do that, they are going to be put under pressure by the top 4 or 5 best scrums in the world. And that's something that they've got to fix on their road to the World Cup, and especially before the Six Nations, as I think France, Ireland and Scotland are bang on right now at the scrum time and will give them a tough test. I think when you look at the whole, what's going to happen, will there be coach change? I don't foresee Eddie changing at this point, this close to the World Cup. But it was the first time I felt like I've seen England booed in a while. The fans seem very disenchanted with what's going on. And I think the union would be smart to get ahead of this, to have transparency, to, have a proper review that people can feel like there's some change going to happen from it. And then let's see where the dust falls and decisions are made. But for right now, it's not the best place for England. I think the players, the players who played for England are fully committed. A lot of the time, Eddie takes the responsibility. He said it's on me. And that is partly the truth. I think if England aren't showing a clear identity, a clear path to where they want to play, how they're trying to go to the World Cup, that's, proper, fuel to get people worried and be unhappy. And, I don't really have a problem with people being frustrated after seeing some of the performances they have in this autumn. But it's also tough because, against New Zealand, there were some bright sparks. I don't feel like, in that game, it was pretty poor until the last 10 minutes in a lot of ways, but I thought their attack was actually working quite well. They were just missing opportunities in the 22. Finally, in the last, 10 minutes, they go bang, 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 and they rescue a draw, which could have been another embarrassing defeat for England. But then you just saw none of that attack against the Springboks. I think they were maybe caught up in the amount of kicking, the pressure, the territory game that South Africa play, can't hold up at the set piece. That fuels that game plan. And I think, England went back in their shell, and that's something Eddie's going to have to address. England are going to have to address, especially before this Six Nations. But I do feel like they're putting a lot of the emphasis on they're going to turn it around for the World Cup. I've been in England programs where you sort of diffuse pressure and aim towards a World Cup. And, sometimes it can be to your detriment because when you get to that World Cup, you're not reinforced from pressure and, you're put in a tough position. But I think that's enough on England. I think we'll see how that story develops over the next week or two, and we'll probably cover it more. But now let's look to USA Rugby. And I think last week's episode, we had CEO Ross Young on. We talked a number of things. We talked, accountability, where the issues lie for this union, what the review process is going to be like. I think I touched on at the end of the episode. I think we need, just like I said for England, transparency. Who's going to sit on this panel? Who's going to review it? Where are the areas that are going to be looked at through a microscope? Is it going to be people that already have a stake or skin in the game? Or is it going to be outside objectivized and we get transparency? And as fans and people that are cared about, what are the solutions? Where does it go? I think Ross answered a number of tough questions there. I thought the MLR versus SLAR situation was really eye-opening. I think that got a few people's attention. It'll be interesting the way it goes. He made it sound like there's a strong chance USA are going to have their own SLAR team this year. So I think wait and see on that, because there's not really been any rumblings publicly of that yet. So how does that look? How does that interact with the MLR? Lots of questions there. I thought the big thing as well was getting an idea of the schedule, understanding, what a potential US calendar could look like. Ross sort of explaining it, then you can build a commercial model, viability, success when you actually know what you're trying to sell and what you're trying to build. And I do completely agree with him. I think the loss of the ARC was a big one for the USA. I do think this problem's been around for a long time, and potentially some of the issues that are talked about in last week's episode and this week's episode are things that haven't just appeared. They've been here for a long time, but USA Rugby have been up and down, in turmoil at times, bankruptcies, and really the bankruptcies were always allowed to recover by World Rugby being there to help them. With COVID happening, World Rugby not in a position to sort of, bail USA Rugby out. That set them back. That put them in this sort of downward spiral predicament, which really is, in my mind, one of the key aspects that led to the failed qualification of the World Cup. Is this was just allowed to go on way too long before these issues addressed. And hopefully this is sort of the moment where, a lot of this stuff can be enacted with change. And one thing I got to talk about, I got a little bit of pushback, but fully disclosure, I asked some tough questions to Ross. And yes, I was involved for, a week or so in that USA Rugby camp in Colorado, coached the Scrum. Absolutely loved it. It was a dream role and opportunity for me. I think I'm born to be involved in that setup at some point in my life. It's very close to my heart, and I feel from where I coach in the Scrum aspect, I could offer a lot of value to that program and the next generation of American props. And I think maybe disclosing that and being open with that might have been something I could have done in the episode a little bit, but at the same time, this is my main vocation. This is my job, working for NBC Sports. And, to ask those questions, we are the World Cup, broadcaster in the United States. And the fact that America aren't going to be participating in the World Cup is a big story, something that needs to be touched on. And part of the reason I didn't go too much into the coaching and the decisions on the field or selection or things like that was purely because I did have an inside knowledge to some of that aspects. I count Gary Gold, Ross Young, a lot of the other coaches at the USA Rugby as friends. So tried to address it more from a big picture structural issue that needs to be addressed. And, I think that's really what we're trying to get out of it. And if we look to today's episode, we continue our conversation. I think we start with, high school collegiate pathways. We talk through high performance issues, review, the system of a lot of those stuff going on in the United States, and then look towards World Rugby's involvement. What do they actually going to offer USA Rugby? What does that partnership look like? Who's in control? Where's it all going? Lots to talk about. Let's get into it. All right, so one area that we haven't talked about yet is some of the pathway, the structures in place for this player development pool. Because when you look at America from a rugby participation level, we're actually not bad when you look at us compared to the rest of the world. Obviously a big country, but right now we obviously not produce, it's not structuring up and producing to the top level, or those aren't being seen on the fruition at the top level. So where are some of the issues that need to be addressed? Because right now from the outside in, a structure around high schools, collegiate rugby, collectivizing that. There was, I think, a move after the EY audit to decentralize some of that away from USA Rugby. Do you think going forward, you guys will have to take more control of that and try and restructure that? Because at the moment, it's so piecemeal and disjointed that it really is doing a disservice to this big picture that I feel like we're all trying to go towards, which is the success of the game, the national team, and rugby on a whole in America.
I mean, it comes back to that unite, ignite, grow. Remember that the strap line, which I don't think anybody will ever have any arguments with. And, you know, we certainly still aren't as united as we should be. I think when you look at some of the key pieces from EY, that didn't really go into the HP pathways. It was more of the mass participation and trying to decentralize, federalize, as you said, the mass participation that then would give us the opportunity to put the player identification structures in place, if you like, across the different levels through youth and high school, through collegiate, through club structures, and then obviously MLR and MLR academies moving forward. I still think with the geography and the MLRs integrating better with senior clubs within their geographic area, trying to work as best they can with colleges in their geographical area. Again, I think you and I have talked about this, Alex, for a while, is that the USA Rugby has existed within these silos that are not geography based, they're participation age based. So how can we do that better by creating geographical structures to allow entities to feed and work together better from a youth and high school, from a college, from a club perspective, and then an MLR perspective, so that that everyone's more aware of what everyone else is doing in those areas. But in a country this size and scale, you can't do all of that mass participation centrally. You have to have hubs. You have to have boots on the ground regionally to be able to do that. So I know the MLR, and you were part of that in and around the LA structure, Alex, with the working more with youth and high schools and school curriculum systems. Lots of good stuff in California in general, in Texas. There's lots of good positive things happening with, that the MLR are taken on board working with youth and high school. But as you said, there's then a gap in the middle with collegiate. I mean, as everyone's aware, the collegiate landscape is disparate. It certainly is, always has been and will be our intention to try and pull that back together as much as we can do. Collegiate sport is complicated. Nobody's going to deny that. So I think pathways, investment in pathways and pulling things back to ensure that there is the right pipeline, there is the right player identification processes at all levels of the game, and then having the opportunity to have those younger groups come together, sort of feed into what we said earlier, Alex. If we're going to, if we're talking about initially from a SLAR perspective, and then, potentially even in conjunction with the MLR, having those younger age grade academy sides that potentially aren't involved in the collegiate game, playing against senior clubs, MLR teams and potentially SLAR teams, as you narrow that pyramid, are all things we've got to look for in the men's game for sure.
So, couple things. So the decentralization from mass participation to regionalizing, do you think that's been successful, and do you think that should continue, or do you think USA Rugby should not maybe bring it back, but do you think they should take a bit more control, or are you happy with the way that's going?
I think there have been a number of successes in various different areas. If you look at what youth and high school have done in particular to bounce back from COVID, and the initiatives that they're putting in place as I think has been strong. So the collegiate area, was undoubtedly hampered for longer than most with COVID and getting back to play and getting structures in place. And realistically, it's only been the last 6 months or so that even some of that core activity has gone in place. I think, as we said from the start, and even when you get to the senior club area, Alex, that we have to provide the tools, we have to provide the support. I think with regard to pure mass participation, that has to remain regionalised, but we have to support it better. Building out this growth plan with World Rugby, having the ability to have a fund that will draw down from some of the assets of the World Cup to be able to start spending on specific projects sooner rather than later. I think that will help galvanise that, and I think again there is lots of work going on in the background, and the target date to go live with that is in and around the World Rugby meetings in May. But I think if we've got a decent fund to be able to drive some of that growth, then it's us having oversight of that is important, because we want those plans to come in with, if you like, ROI attached to it, so we know what we're trying to achieve with participation. So I think if we can help fund, guide, and give the tools, but ultimately we're going to need everyone out there to provide the infrastructure to allow it to actually be facilitated.
No, great answer, mate. I agree. Let's just look at that collegiate bit now you touched on. Like, this is something that I think is high priority to be addressed. And it's been a factor in this long-term development for me that there's no collective sort of plan with the collegiate system. It's fragmented. For some people listening or watching who maybe don't know, East Coast, West Coast schools kind of have a variation of seasons, which makes it difficult. You have sort of, a lot of variety of different competitions across the board. Is trying to collectivize this, put a proper plan together, something that's on the agenda or on the to-do list now going forward in this runway to the World Cup?
Listen, if we all knew the answers, we wouldn't be sitting here raising these questions now, Alex. I think
they're good questions. They're good questions. I feel like they have to be discussed.
Yeah, listen, they do, and there has to be a plan. I mean, when you look at it from the outside in, that we all have done, you look at, university facilities. I think access to facilities, access to resource within the university structure is key. I mean, I'm a great believer, and again, we've talked about this for a while, and I think it's one of the things that we can hopefully accelerate and make a reality in some ways is where does the NCAA structure sit within that overall strategy? And I think it's much clearer on the women's side than the men's side. Amy and the crew in NIRA have done a great job, and we've had a couple of additions to that emerging sports program for NIRA. I think if we can almost concentrate on that from the women's side and be very clear on what we're doing about getting ourselves to full NCAA status, and the raise in profile that will give, and obviously all the synergies of what happened to soccer a couple of decades ago when they did the same thing about raising the profile of that sport within the collegiate domain with the women first, is something that to me is always is a little bit of a no-brainer in providing some of the funding to get us to that magical 40 number, and then almost pull everything in on the back of it. I think that's going to be key to it. The more structured competition support, as you said, East Coast, West Coast, time difference, seasonality of when people play. There's no easy nirvana of what we're going to try and achieve with regard to rugby in the collegiate space, but I think that we need to identify a couple of key initiatives that we know we can support well, and then build from there. I just don't think there's an easy answer. We say, right, this is what we're going to do to achieve parity and get everyone pulling together. Let's pick a couple of key initiatives, show that they can work, and then build the rest of it out in the collegiate game.
Would you consider going to someone like World Rugby and saying, listen, this World Cup in 2031, 33, do you think there's any potential World Rugby would ever invest in the collegiate system to actually build out those varsity programs, potentially fund them? Because for me, it actually is such a key cog in the American sporting landscape. If you look at high school sports are all tiered towards trying to get into college. A lot of the top athletes are looking at scholarships, opportunities, education, all combined in one. That's sort of the real sort of power and pull factor that I think American universities have from a sporting landscape. If there was a way to try and say, hey, these programs could be funded, it could maybe circumvent Title IX if they funded the programs or the scholarships or the pathway, the avenues. Do you think that could be a big cog in steering more D1 or more top athletic talent to rugby, and then also creating a factory that, you know, the collegiate system is a factory for the NFL, the NBA, for soccer, for all these other aspects. And I think right now in rugby, it is a missing part that could really churn upwards towards whatever's above, from an MLR to a SLAR to a Eagles competition that we, or structure that we can build. It all seems like a really important area to potentially look at resource and focus.
Yeah, I think for sure that we also have to be realistic, Alex. I think it's easy to sit there and say, and we've talked about it at the board level and discussed it at the NCAA structures are there to support, you know, the traditional American sports. You know, yes, it's been successful in turning over numbers for, if you look at the non-traditional support in soccer, I suppose, it's solved a number of problems, but, you know, has it made the US national team a world beater in the soccer stage, considering how much money and resource has gone into soccer in the US, where it sits within NCAA structures now, you know, where the MLS sits, if you're talking about ranking within world leagues, if you like, it's nothing like the same as the NCAA structure and to support around, you know, your football, your basketball, your baseball, your hockeys, etc. It's, you know, that's been built to feed the American system. As we said, a lot of the top end of rugby is based on international structures. So, you know, a lot of the best American talent that the NCAA creates currently goes, you know, even if they're not taken earlier, to academies in Europe. So it's, you know, even if you look at different models of structures of more global sports, that's also not as straightforward as it would be when, you know, for how the NCAA feeds traditional American sports, Alex. So, but with regard to particular projects and helping fund and helping, as you said, build more programs, and do what we're doing in college in a better way. Yeah, undoubtedly there could, should, and probably will be World Rugby funding that will be made available as part of this overall fund for sure.
Good to hear. And then, like, just from a high performance, from these pathways, whose role is that right now at USA Rugby? Is this Dan Payne? Is this under you? Like, where does it sit under sort of administration factor from you guys?
Yeah, it's Dan's remit, and I think, you know, Dan's had an incredibly tough job again, considering you look at where all the high performance focus has come in. We've ended up with a huge traffic jam with the delay of tournaments. Obviously, the World Cup Sevens, the Women's World Cups now rolling straight into pretty much into a Men's World Cup, is that the focus has been on trying to get those teams prepped for those tournaments. So when Dan came on board, one of the things that, you know, he really wanted to focus on, and we did, you know, as a board and ourselves as the national office, was, you know, Dan's experience, understanding his time as an AD, you know, within the collegiate system, was building out the pathways and the programs. That we wanted that to be our focus. We haven't had the time or resource to be able to do that up till this point for all the things we've talked about over the last hour. But that's his remit, but he ultimately needs way more support to be able to deliver what we need to deliver in that area if we're going to be successful with it. Like everything in this world, Alex, so much of it comes down to resource and cash and funding to be able to do it and do it well.
And Dan's obviously, you know, he was at Life University, then was at USA Rugby as a CEO, then with Americas. Do you think he's the right guy and the equipped one to build out these things and then also sit above from a high performance aspect? Because that's the next question. I've got a few questions on what's going on with those teams, but it's quite an influential role. And I wouldn't say like him coming in initially from the outside would be the exact fitting of the T of who you'd be hiring in that role. So those are just my questions, because, you know, these are all things on Twitter that people are asking or commenting on. So I'm like, let's just put it to him and let you answer and get this on the record.
Listen, it's not a one-man job. You're 100% right. Dan was brought in initially because we really wanted to go back and review pathways and, and have that focus on that area. I think, the review of our high performance structures, when you look at our overall budgets and what we've got to do, we've been in a bit of a holding phase for it. Certainly one of the things that we'll look to do now is to reassess where we sit with regard to prioritisation and focusing in and around both men's 15s, women's 15s, and the sevens programs. But Dan can't do it on his own. And as you say, that there's nobody out there that you'd say that has the absolute skill set and experience to cover all the aspects that we've talked about in the last 40 minutes to the absolute maximum. And you'd have to be Superman, and he may well struggle to do it, or Superwoman to struggle to do it, given the questions that have been asked. And I think one of the things that we all talk about is what we've tried to do is, with as much equity as possible, support all of our programs to the best of our ability. I think one of the issues that we have, again, around us in different areas is, unless you're the big boys, that the developed nations, the Six Nations, and even not all of them, same thing, not all the rugby championship nations in Argentina, for example, don't have to have and don't want to have the same focus on sevens, 15s, men's and women's. And we have to do that, which requires a huge amount of resource.
Last question on the high performance, but I think, after some maybe hindsight or reviewing back to the Women's World Cup or the 2021 World Cup we just had, and the fact that, US players didn't really share sevens and 15s. The programs were kept separate. Other countries had a lot of success with that player pool share, from New Zealand to France to Canada. Who makes those decisions, and then who reflects on those, maybe, as a good decision, a bad decision, or what, now that the dust has settled on that campaign?
Yeah, it's a question that's been raised on a number of fronts. I think when you look at the difference between a country like New Zealand, that's a small country, that they're allowed to train together, play together, have assembly time at various times. They obviously don't have players playing in the Allianz Premiership when the sevens team are training in Chula Vista. The whole different set of circumstances, but allowed much more interaction throughout the previous 12 months, if you like. I think we always knew going into it that with the large chunk of our playing squad for New Zealand being in the Allianz Premiership, meant that the opportunity to integrate, if you like, even from a training perspective and assembly perspective, any of the girls that were setting up for the World Cup in the Sevens World Cup in South Africa was going to be incredibly difficult. So the decision was made relatively early that to focus on either one of the two programs. And as you said, Jordan, Mateus, and Led decided to go with 15s, and the sevens girls stayed dedicated with the sevens program. I think Canada were relatively similar. I think they only had one player that didn't really get involved in the starting team that got added to it. England certainly didn't have any. France, the same, was very limited. I think the fact that we had to have good quality assembly time, the warm-up games in the UK against England and Scotland just before that wouldn't have been involved any of those teams, is you've got that whole extended squad training together, playing together for the longest period they've ever had, and the opportunity to have assemblies. Is the point of difference going to be so great that it's going to be beneficial to then drop them out of a team that's been building its culture and cohesion and togetherness as a group? Do the benefits outweigh that or not? And obviously, ultimately, that's a head coach's call. That's what the head coach's role is, and it's something that Rob stuck by, and I think he still convinces that is the right decision. So I think when your head coaches are around, being accountable, and that was an early call that Rob made.
No, fair enough, mate. I'd say the only thing I'd say back to that is, when you look at the player pool and, the resources in the women's game, that Sevens program is the only full-time professional female athletes that the US currently has available to them. And so, to maybe not have them be involved, just from a talent pool process, I do think it's only going to be a couple, but an Alona Mar, a Christy Kirsch, a few that may have added a bit of spice to that player pool always seemed like potentially made sense to me. I just curious under hindsight how that was reviewed. And then lastly, we'll park that, but I just want to get a little bit on, because I know your time's precious, just to the World Rugby and the big picture. With the World Cup looming down the 8 years, you've already alluded to some of the changes, some of the resources they're investing in. Like, how big a relationship are USA Rugby and World Rugby going to have going forward? Because from my understanding, they're setting up offices in the US, setting up potentially a commercial arm to help assist. Like, will they sit above you? Will they sit with you? Will they offer resources? How do you foresee that relationship going forward in this next chapter? And how impactful do you think that relationship will be to enact real change?
It's massively important, and we've touched on it at various points during the last hour, Corbs. I think it's very much going to be a joint venture. Alan talked very eloquently about it at the the media briefing post the awarding of 31 and 33, is that this is a huge opportunity for the game globally, to unlock the US market, but that won't happen unless the US is unlocked for its own means through USA Rugby and the game within the US. So it is a partnership that we've talked about during the whole bidding phase of the World Cups, is that we have to work closely together. I think, as we said, from a commercial perspective, they give us a bit more oomph and drive and resource to really push that across co-selling and building value and building return of investment across multiple properties, as well as improving the calendarization that we have. So, with them setting up a much more strong, robust internal commercial arm, running that in partnership with us is key. And I think the other areas around growth initiatives, community involvement, that's a joint strategy approach. So the World Cup as a specific project will always be a little bit of a standalone from its own tournament P&L, but it's never going to be as straightforward as just having that sitting out on one side. Is that we want to maximize the opportunity. And I think one of the analogies that's been used a couple of times is, we're coming in and partnering strategically with very much a commercial focus, but strategically and operationally, and what we're trying to do with regard to resource and money as well in some of the other areas is akin to us putting the training wheels on the bike for the next 10 years as a national governing body, to be fully sustainable, standalone. Hopefully one of those wheels comes off relatively quickly, and then we're actually freewheeling on our own way before 31 and 33. But the idea is that when those World Cups have been and gone, World Rugby ease away from that partnership, and we are a strong, robust, sustainable union, with 4 successful programs and much higher participation rates than we have now across the board for all aspects of the game.
And when you look at sort of the plan, the work that needs to be done together, like, is it just USA Rugby and World Rugby that write these plans? Are there other stakeholders? Like, how do you sort of gauge the other strategic partners and the other players maybe needed to really enact a lot of this success?
Listen, I think, that comes out of the global rugby family, and part of this last year and a lot of the work that's been going on behind the scenes has been the involvement of myself, Jonathan Atkinson, Dan Payne, in various different multi-stakeholder work streams with other unions, both the developed unions and performance unions. I've been sitting on committees and working groups with the CEOs of the Sanzar and Six Nations, plus with the executive teams from Six Nations and Sanzar themselves, about how we better integrate ourselves across both the men's and women's games. So it's certainly not done in isolation. yes, it gets driven by World Rugby and us, but World Rugby is ultimately the governing body that's made up in its membership by the other stakeholder unions, and we have to have the buy-in of them. And in fairness, they all understand the importance of the success of 31 and 33. And, I think we are making real progress in getting them to buy in and support and almost give up some of the things that they've, that traditionally have been their own full domains, to allow wider involvement, not just of the US, but the likes of the US, Japan, Fiji, Uruguay, the other Pacific Islands, the other American nations, Canada, etc. The global game is only going to grow if it goes beyond the Six Nations Championship and the Rugby Championship teams. It will ultimately stagnate and die if there's not open conversation and the doors are open in a long-term way to more crossover fixtures and more opening up of those tournaments. And it's been really positive input from all of those groups in how we make that happen.
And then, it's exciting what potentially could happen from this, because I do feel like we touched at the beginning, heartbreak right now for the situation that's going on, but potential silver lining is the wake-up call and the true addressing of some of these issues that I think have plagued you guys and this whole journey for a long time. But now is the time that you actually have to fix it, or you're not gonna, or you're never gonna get to this World Cup and be where you want to be. And so hopefully that's sort of the realization and wake-up call that gives you guys resources. But yourself, say USA Rugby, the current leadership, the board, the people sort of, sitting above that do have accountability for right now, do you feel any pressure or anything right now for your own security? Or do you feel like you've been secured in that this is the ability that you guys have been waiting for to try and make change?
So I think, you're not doing your job properly if you're not, if you're not aware of accountability and issues and pressure coming on, Alex. It's whether I'm in this seat, or whether you're Bill Sweeney at the RFU, or you look at the pressure Mark Robinson's under in New Zealand. It's not an easy job. You can't sit there in the comfort with your feet up on the table smoking a cigar saying, oh, we've got the World Cup awarded now, the hard yards have been done, I'm safe. And to me, it's not a personal issue. It's about what we do collectively as a union and how we move forward. And I'm certainly 100% committed into really building out this detailed 10-year plan with World Rugby. So we have made huge inroads to doing it. It's not a straightforward exercise. We want to get it right. So yes, there's always pressure. If you're involved with leading an NGB, it's we've all seen it, whether it's social media or not, Alex, or various different one-on-one discussions. Is people want leadership, and then you make decisions, and people throw grenades saying they're the wrong one. So you get complaints if you don't do anything, and if you aggressively go and do things, then you also get complaints that you're doing something wrong. So it's an eternal balancing act. But I'm certainly committed to try and build and lead. It's been an absolutely brutal 3 years as part of this process, and as we said, it's at some point we've got to turn the tanker and get going things in the right direction. And as you said, huge disappointment about the results of last weekend, but maybe we now have a benefit to forget about short term and start really addressing the mid to long term capabilities and putting that plan in place.
And then lastly, the news has been circulating a bit about potential Eddie Jones involvement in the USA Rugby setup. There's talks of an 8-year contract going ahead. Is that a USA Rugby potential viewpoint? Is that a World Rugby? Another thing that we've talked about. Someone like Eddie, I think, would have potentially a lot of upside given an 8-year runway and enough resources to enact change. Is there any truth to that, or can you comment on anything on that at the moment?
No, listen, there's no truth in that. Eddie's been very vocal. I know Eddie well. Eddie's always been vocal on the fact he'd love to get involved in a project like the US. We've got to go through our review process, and we've got to make the decisions right for the program moving forward. Whether we decide to to stick by Gary, or having going through this review process, look elsewhere. That I firmly believe that someone like Eddie wouldn't take this job unless there was a bunch of capability or a bunch of guarantees around player access and opportunities to work with players that we're not in a position to give anybody now. Whether that's Gary or Eddie. I think coaching's one thing. I think the biggest issue that we've got is far more deep rooted than just the coaching side. So we need to make sure that we get those elements in place, and then we'll do this review process, and then we'll make the call of who that right person is to lead us forward. But there's certainly no truth in the fact that there's a contract there ready to be signed by Eddie for the next 8 years. That's for sure.
Thanks for clarifying that. And then last, while we're on coaches, there's always a debate in America, like foreign coach, American coach. How do we sort of continue to, bring up these American coaches so they are in positions for these roles? Most of our programs right now have foreign coaches in place. Like, going forward, something to be reviewed. Is it going to be a requirement of potentially future foreign coaches to actually have to live in America and be there full time? Or do you think there's still an avenue to continue this in and out? But with some of the things you talked about flying teams around for logistic reasons and costs, there's always an issue of coaches flying in and around. And then the big thing is, should coaches be here full time, really committing to that coach education and developing more American coaches for this system?
Yeah, it's certainly in an ideal scenario, you'd want the coaches to be on ground as part of you, especially if you've got longer periods of daily training environments. I mean, someone like Gary had committed to move over, which was scuppered by the whole COVID nightmare for periods anyway during this cycle. I think given the fact that there's going to be an increased inventory, there's going to be increased games. With that, we're going to need more assembly time, and it's certainly the objective. One, to have coaching staffs for our national teams based, and that based in the US, that will take a little bit of transitioning towards. And ideally we want more American born and bred and coaches coming through the pipeline. If you look at Jamie Burke, Kate Daly, etc., and on the women's side, we're getting there. You look at the work that Zach's doing with Emily, Ben Pinkelman with Mike on the 15s. You look at the likes of Scott Lawrence and Sean Pittman, who have been involved with the men's national 15s program, and Sean had thinking about the long term. Sean took that team down to the APC, so we've certainly got coaches in the pipeline to do that. The idea is to keep on giving them more experience, and we certainly want more Americans in the coaches, same as players, in the pipeline and pushing it out at the top end. But ultimately, we've got to put the right person in the right job with the right skill sets to be able to do it.
I think it's a good place to leave it there, mate. Ross, thank you so much for your time, your insight, and your honesty, sharing it. I know it's not the easiest time to talk about a lot of these, but we really appreciate you coming on, mate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it. And hopefully we see each other face to face at some point in the not too distant future.
Look forward to a beer soon, mate.
Cheers. Take care.
Cheers. And that is a wrap on the Ross Young interview. Really big thank you again for him to coming on. And I did hit him with some hard questions. Some I think he opened up more than others, but let's just do a quick recap just before we finish off and sort of draw a line under some of this, of some of the things talked about. I think from the pathways to university, I think there was a recognition that they need to maybe have a stronger focus of connecting that sort of decentralization with an overall model. Similar themes that continue through this pod is money and resource. And at the moment, USA Rugby have been in no position to offer either of those. World Rugby are the ones who could step in to help this. This seems a key area that needs funds imminently in this 8-year build up to the next World Cup. I do think that there has to be more urgency on trying to align the collegiate model. I know how Ross is saying, let's just focus on a few things. And it just seems like insurmountable to try and address some of these, lack of synergies between the conferences, the seasons, all of these things. To me, this is another area that needs to be addressed. I think you look at Japan, they've invested in their collegiate system that feeds into their pro system. It's all sort of aligned. I don't think the comparison with soccer is as applicable here, just because soccer's a different game. A lot of times, university or that period isn't even really in the model. By the time these kids are in university, they're usually playing in the top leagues in the world. So by 18, it's more of a high school model of development of soccer where the big gains are made, where I think rugby could definitely have more of a place to churn players up towards the MLR and the Eagles, especially if you're able to offer real sort of educational pathways as well as sporting opportunities and proper resource programs. That to me is a game changer. If I'm World Rugby, I'm looking at one of the areas to sort of get involved in there. Now let's move on to high performance. Asked a few hard questions there. And this is probably an area that is going to be scrutinized. Obviously, it's going to be a high performance review into the men's 15s. Gary, all that staff will be under scrutiny. And, that is sport. Like, as much as I love Gary, the results dictate a review. What looks like might happen in the future, we can get on to, but I think that's very necessary. Like I said in the opening show, with transparency, I do think there's a high performance sort of review that needs to be looked at in the state of all the programs, from the women 15s not having the greatest success at the World Cup to the women's sevens probably had a year where I felt they didn't achieve what they're capable of and potentially went backwards from where they were after the Olympics. There was change at the top in the coaching there, promoting within, Emily Bidewell moving in. That's an area that, this is a big year with Olympic qualification and stuff on the line. That needs to be addressed. I think, as well as the men's sevens programs, Mike's been there for a long time. It's been an up and down ride at times. He's been very unlucky with injuries and consistencies. But at the same time, we have to see continued growth and progression to make sure that it's worth continuing to invest in those programs and in the current coaching structure model. So I think all of this, as World Rugby get more involved, need to be looked at, and it's just the reality of sport, performance, and getting this puzzle right, all sort of synergizing for the success of the game in the United States, but also for the success in the 21 and 33 World Cups. I do think they should have shared sevens players. Like, I'll stay on the record on the women's side in this World Cup. I know it was a bit conflated because of the delayed World Cup. They then overlap. But I just can't see an argument that justifies that, especially under hindsight. But understanding, that's Rob Kane's decision, as Ross Young said, and you sort of, reap the accountability of those decisions. And I'm sure these people will all be reviewed in what's best for the picture going forward. And, it's a tough one for me because I care a lot of these people. I have personal relationships with a lot of these people, but I also really care about rugby in America and the success. And I feel very privileged in this platform that I have and this podcast and the role at NBC to shine a light on some of these issues and just trying to be constructive, not trying to pull down, not trying to tear apart, but trying to analyze and look to where the improvements can be made. Last thing we talked about, World Rugby's involvement. I think that's long overdue. Like I said earlier in the show, the COVID issue didn't allow them to sort of re-inject funds in probably when they hit the bankruptcy, which led to more of these issues, coming to a head of where USA Rugby at with a depleted lack of resources and inability to put together a new calendar change. That's on USA Rugby and World Rugby. But hopefully now with World Rugby realizing the urgency of the matter, giving the resources and the funds, giving these, people in these roles like Dan Payne more resources to try and enact change. Hopefully that works for the better, because I think the other question that I touched on, and, it might ruffle some feathers, is, should we be having international coaches coming in and out of the country? I think, just my personal view of where we're at, and it's not a personal indictment of any coach in that situation, because I think if USA Rugby hires you for that role, that's your right. You're not made to live here. That's part of the hiring process. But for my opinion, going forward, especially with this 8-year runway, I think being based in the US has got to be close to a non-negotiable now. And it's just something that needs to be looked at. You want to be on the ground. You want to be constantly educating coaches, spreading the game. And I think America has showed that it has the pull factor when you look at some of the coaches in the MLR, that being in America is enough carrot to dangle to find the right coaches there. That's just my personal opinion. It's not even directed at a person, coach, or anything. It's just something I feel for the systems. And then lastly, I think the Eddie Jones news. We showed a snippet of it last week. You got more of it this week. I think with Eddie Jones, Ross dismissed that there's any sort of contract or deal going on, but I do think maybe behind the scenes, there is a plan to bring in, maybe not Eddie, but someone like that on an 8-year journey with resources, commitments. But all of this stuff, I think, needs to be worked out. Like Ross said in the first episode, probably in the first quarter of this year, there's going to be a lot of restructuring, a lot of plans, a lot of reviewing what's been going right or wrong, and hopefully some implementation of a long-term plan of action, which can right the ship back to where it needs to be and deliver a lot of the things Ross talked about: successful teams, growth, financial security for the unions. All of those things I completely agree with. I really got to credit Ross for coming on. I did ask him some hard questions, but I think that's for the best of everyone. Transparency in these moments are key. There's a lot of disenchanted fans or frustrated fans, and being able to hear someone like Ross, who's the head of the organization, open up and talk about that, I think is massive. So thank you to Ross. Thank you for all the support of this podcast. You know, for anyone that maybe gets upset of some of the things I said, I'm sorry. It's just honest and open conversations. I wish everyone the best. Thanks a lot for listening, sharing, liking, favoriting, retweeting this podcast. We really appreciate all the support. Thank you so much. We'll see you again next week.